What will happen to Donald Trump if courts rule his California troop use illegal? Imagine this: a former president deploying federal troops into California cities under the banner of restoring order, only to have the courts step in and declare that move illegal. That's not just a political headline, it's a constitutional earthquake. For Donald Trump, a ruling like this could go far beyond courtroom drama. It would strike at the very core of his claims to authority, raise fresh questions about presidential overreach, and ignite fierce debate about the limits of executive power in America. More than that, it could reshape the narrative of his 2024 campaign, as voters weigh whether a man already tested by legal defeats should be trusted with power again. The stakes? Immense. The fallout? Potentially historic. Stay tuned as we break it down right now. The deployment of military forces within the United States is one of the most sensitive and controversial decisions any president can make. It touches on constitutional boundaries, civil liberties, and the balance of power between federal and state governments. When former President Donald Trump ordered the deployment of National Guard troops to California, specifically to Los Angeles, questions were immediately raised about whether that decision was lawful under the Posse Comitatus Act, a statute designed to prevent the misuse of the military in domestic affairs. Now, with a federal court in California ruling that Trump's deployment was unlawful, the consequences are far-reaching. They span legal risks, political ramifications, and broader institutional challenges for both Trump and the American system of governance. In this script, I will carefully explore what might happen to Donald Trump if the courts definitively rule that his use of California troops was illegal. The analysis will proceed step by step, beginning with the background of the case, the legal foundation, the precedent, Trump's immediate response, and finally the possible long-term outcomes. The deployment of troops to Los Angeles was not a routine administrative matter. It occurred in a moment of heightened political tension and social unrest. Trump had repeatedly expressed frustration with Democratic-led cities and states, describing them as hellholes and accusing local leaders of failing to maintain law and order. Against that backdrop, he ordered the National Guard to California despite resistance from state officials. This move raised alarm bells because of the Posse Comitatus Act, passed in 1878, which generally prohibits the use of federal military forces to enforce domestic policies or laws unless specifically authorized by Congress. The act has been a cornerstone of American civil-military relations, ensuring that the armed forces are not turned into instruments of political power against citizens. While the National Guard can sometimes be deployed under state authority with the governor's consent, the use of federalized troops in California without clear legal justification was seen by many as an overreach. The recent court ruling in the Northern District of California declared that Trump's deployment violated the statute. Although the court stayed its own ruling temporarily pending appeal, the finding itself carries immense symbolic and legal weight. It affirms that Trump acted outside the boundaries of his presidential authority. The heart of the issue lies in the interpretation of the Posse Comitatus Act. This law makes it unlawful to use federal troops to perform the duties of civilian law enforcement unless expressly authorized by Congress or the Constitution. Over time, exceptions have been carved out. For example, the Insurrection Act allows the president to deploy troops under extreme conditions such as rebellion or invasion. However, in the California case, none of those exceptions were present. The unrest in Los Angeles, while serious, did not rise to the level of insurrection. Local authorities had not requested federal troops, and the situation was being managed at the state and municipal levels. By ordering the National Guard into Los Angeles unilaterally, Trump appears to have bypassed the legal framework designed to restrain presidential power. The court's decision reflects this interpretation. It emphasizes that the president cannot simply invoke broad executive authority to send troops into a state whenever he sees fit. Such an action undermines federalism, infringes on state sovereignty, and risks turning the military into a domestic policing tool. When asked about the ruling during a press conference, Trump dismissed the judge as a radical left actor. Yet he also emphasized a narrow point in his favor. The same judge allowed the 300 troops already stationed in California to remain temporarily during the appeals process. Trump seized on this detail to claim partial victory. This rhetorical maneuver is characteristic of Trump's political style. He often reframes setbacks as wins, highlighting any minor concession or ambiguous detail to deflect from the core issue. Yet the broader reality is that a federal court declared his actions illegal, a fact that cannot be erased by spin. Trump also linked the court's ruling to broader grievances about tariffs, the stock market, and even artificial intelligence. This conflation underscores how Trump often responds to specific challenges with sweeping narratives about persecution, global threats, and economic consequences. For him, the ruling becomes not just a legal matter, but another battle in a larger war against his perceived enemies. If appellate courts uphold the decision, the consequences for Trump could unfold along several lines. First, there is the question of accountability for violating the Posse Comitatus Act. While the statute itself is primarily designed to restrain current office holders, not former presidents, the finding that Trump acted unlawfully could open the door to civil litigation. Individuals or organizations affected by the deployment could argue that their rights were violated, seeking damages in federal court. Second, the ruling could influence ongoing investigations into Trump's broader pattern of executive overreach. Prosecutors and congressional committees already scrutinized Trump's actions in areas ranging from the January 6th insurrection to his handling of classified documents. The California case adds another layer to the narrative of a president who disregarded legal boundaries. Third, the decision could affect Trump's political future. If he runs for office again, opponents will use the ruling as evidence that he abused power. Campaign ads and debates would highlight that a federal court found him guilty of deploying troops illegally against American citizens. To understand the gravity of the ruling, it is important to consider the history of the Posse Comitatus Act. The law was enacted after the Civil War during Reconstruction, when federal troops were stationed across the South to enforce civil rights and maintain order. Southern Democrats seeking to end military occupation pushed for restrictions on presidential authority. Since then, the act has been respected as a safeguard against military involvement in domestic politics. Presidents have been cautious about testing its limits. Even in moments of crisis, such as the civil rights marches, anti-war protests, or natural disasters, executives have generally sought legal cover through the Insurrection Act or state requests. Trump's decision to send troops to California without such justification is therefore unusual and alarming. It represents a break from decades of restraint and respect for the civilian-military divide. Courts, by ruling against him, are reaffirming the traditional boundaries that protect American democracy. The ruling's political implications are significant. Trump has long presented himself as a law and order president, willing to take tough measures against crime and unrest. For his supporters, deploying troops to California might seem like decisive leadership. Yet the court's decision reframes that narrative. Instead of a strong protector, Trump is cast as an authoritarian who broke the law. For Democrats and independents, this finding reinforces concerns about Trump's disregard for constitutional limits. It provides concrete, judicially recognized evidence that Trump abused his power. That evidence can be mobilized in political campaigns, congressional hearings, and media coverage. For Republicans, the situation is more complicated. Some may rally behind Trump, framing the ruling as judicial overreach by a liberal court. Others, however, may see it as a liability that weakens Trump's electability in a general election. The ruling thus deepens the internal divisions within the Republican Party. Beyond Trump personally, the case raises broader questions for American institutions. If the courts uphold the ruling, it strengthens the judiciary's role as a check on executive power. It demonstrates that even presidents cannot ignore statutory limits. It also reaffirms the principle of federalism. States like California have the right to manage their own internal security unless an extraordinary federal interest is at stake. By siding with California, the court reinforces the balance of power between state and federal governments. Finally, the case sends a signal to future presidents. The temptation to use the military for domestic purposes may arise again in times of crisis. This ruling will serve as a warning that such actions carry legal risks. Donald Trump's reaction to the California ruling has already revealed his immediate playbook: appeal the decision, cast it as politically motivated, and transform the legal setback into fuel for his political narrative. This strategy mirrors his broader approach in other legal and political controversies. Each time he faces institutional pushback, whether from prosecutors, courts, or congressional committees, Trump reframes the issue as proof that he is the victim of a coordinated campaign by radical left judges or partisan enemies determined to silence him. In practical terms, Trump's legal team will pursue an appeal, most likely arguing that the president's constitutional powers under Article 2 give him broad discretion to protect national security and maintain order. They will claim that his decision to deploy the National Guard to Los Angeles was justified under the commander-in-chief role and necessary to prevent escalating violence. In this framing, the deployment was not a political stunt, but an exercise of legitimate authority. However, this line of defense carries serious limitations. The Posse Comitatus Act sets a clear legal boundary. Federal troops cannot be used in domestic law enforcement except in extraordinary circumstances authorized by Congress. Courts are historically reluctant to expand presidential powers beyond those written into law. Trump's defense may persuade some of his supporters, but judges are bound to the statute's text and its long-standing interpretation. Unless his lawyers can demonstrate an imminent threat equivalent to insurrection, the argument is unlikely to succeed. Politically, the strategy of framing the ruling as partisan also has mixed potential. For Trump's loyal base, particularly those who already distrust the judiciary and mainstream media, the message resonates strongly. It reinforces the perception that Trump is the outsider fighting against entrenched elites and hostile institutions. Every ruling against him becomes another chapter in the story of persecution, energizing rallies, and fundraising appeals. But the risks are significant. Moderates and independents, voters who often decide national elections, may see the ruling not as partisan lawfare but as an objective legal check on executive abuse. By dismissing the decision as politically motivated, Trump risks alienating voters who place high value on the rule of law and institutional integrity. He positions himself permanently on the defensive, responding to legal defeats rather than articulating a clear and positive vision for governance. Moreover, this approach entrenches Trump in a cycle of grievance politics. Instead of pivoting toward forward-looking policies, he remains locked in rhetorical battles about his treatment by courts and investigators. While this may sustain enthusiasm among his most committed supporters, it narrows his coalition and undermines his ability to broaden appeal in a general election. Ultimately, Trump's strategy moving forward is both predictable and precarious. He will continue to fight the ruling in court, portray himself as a victim of judicial activism, and rally his base around the idea of resistance. Yet in doing so, he risks deepening the divide between his loyalists and the broader electorate, while leaving himself vulnerable to a cumulative record of legal defeats that no amount of spin can fully erase. If the courts ultimately uphold the California ruling, several plausible scenarios emerge for Trump's legal and political future. Each carries different degrees of risk and consequence, but together they form a mosaic of uncertainty that could shape his trajectory in profound ways. Scenario 1: minimal immediate impact, but cumulative damage. It is entirely possible that the ruling will not directly affect Trump in the short term. He is no longer in office, and the courts may view the matter as primarily a constitutional clarification rather than a vehicle for punishment. Yet even if the decision does not trigger immediate penalties, the reputational cost is considerable. Every additional legal finding against Trump adds weight to the narrative that he habitually disregards the law. Over time, this cumulative damage erodes credibility among undecided voters, particularly those wary of entrusting executive power to someone with a track record of pushing legal boundaries. Scenario 2: renewed calls for accountability. The ruling will not exist in isolation. Advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and political opponents are likely to seize upon it as evidence of authoritarian behavior. They may demand further investigations, congressional hearings, or official inquiries into the broader pattern of Trump's executive overreach. Even without criminal liability, such scrutiny keeps the controversy alive in public discourse. Continuous coverage and debate amplify the sense of misconduct, creating political costs that extend beyond the courtroom. Scenario 3, civil litigation. Perhaps the most tangible risk lies in the potential for lawsuits. Individuals or communities directly affected by the troop deployment could argue that their constitutional rights were infringed. Civil suits against Trump or the federal government could seek financial damages, injunctive relief, or both. While civil litigation often moves slowly, its long duration creates a lingering shadow over Trump's public image. Each new filing, deposition, or court hearing generates headlines that reinforce the theme of accountability. Even if Trump ultimately prevails in court, the process itself imposes reputational and financial costs. Scenario 4, political disqualification through public opinion. Legally, the California ruling does not bar Trump from running for office again. However, the political implications are stark. Opponents will use the decision as evidence that Trump is unfit for the presidency, framing him as a leader who weaponized the military against American citizens. If combined with other ongoing legal troubles, from investigations into January 6th to business fraud trials, the ruling could crystallize a broader narrative of unfitness. In politics, perception is often as consequential as law. Even without formal disqualification, public opinion may shift in ways that make a political comeback increasingly difficult. Taken together, these scenarios illustrate the multifaceted risks Trump faces. None guarantees his downfall, but each chips away at the foundation of credibility and authority upon which any political future must rest. The California ruling also reverberates far beyond America's borders. In an interconnected world, the way the United States manages its constitutional crises sends signals to allies and adversaries alike. For allies in Europe and Asia, the ruling raises pressing questions about the reliability of U.S. leadership. Many democratic nations look to the United States as a model of constitutional governance. Seeing a president accused and judicially confirmed of illegally deploying troops domestically undermines confidence in America's commitment to the rule of law. It may also complicate diplomatic partnerships, as foreign leaders weigh whether domestic instability could translate into inconsistent foreign policy. For adversaries, the ruling provides potent propaganda material. Authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, or Iran are eager to highlight perceived hypocrisy in American democracy. By pointing to Trump's illegal deployment, they can argue that the United States fails to practice the values it preaches abroad. This undermines Washington's moral authority in promoting democracy and human rights. The ruling also shapes international perceptions of U.S. civil-military relations. One of America's great strengths historically has been the strict separation of military and political spheres. When courts must step in to prevent a president from using troops illegally, that tradition appears weakened. Adversaries may interpret this as a sign of internal fragility, emboldening them to challenge U.S. interests abroad. At the same time, the ruling demonstrates resilience. By enforcing legal limits on presidential power, the judiciary shows that American institutions remain capable of self-correction. For allies, this can be reassuring. It signals that even in moments of abuse, the system pushes back. For adversaries, it tempers the propaganda narrative by proving that accountability exists in practice, not just theory. Ultimately, the international dimension of the ruling is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it exposes vulnerabilities and opens the United States to criticism. On the other, it affirms the strength of democratic institutions by holding leaders accountable. For Trump personally, however, the global impact is overwhelmingly negative. His actions become part of a larger story about instability and unpredictability in U.S. leadership, complicating both domestic politics and international reputation. The court ruling against Trump's California troop deployment is more than a legal footnote. It is a significant moment in the ongoing struggle to define the limits of presidential power. If upheld, it could reshape Trump's legacy, constrain his political future, and reaffirm vital democratic principles. For Trump, the ruling is both a legal setback and a political challenge. It exposes him to new risks, strengthens his opponents, and complicates his bid for political resurgence. For the nation, it is a reminder that the rule of law remains a cornerstone of the republic, even in times of division and crisis. Ultimately, what happens to Donald Trump if courts rule his California troop use illegal will depend not only on legal outcomes, but on how the American public interprets the meaning of this decision. Will it be seen as accountability for an abuse of power, or as another skirmish in the endless battles of partisan politics? That is the question the coming months and years will answer. Here's